China's worst nightmare is almost a reality once again. A week after China eased its COVID restrictions, COVID cases across the country are rising at an alarming rate. Unlike other countries, access to information in China is strictly regulated by the communist regime. But some images emerging from the country show the alarming situation on the ground. These images are from inside a stadium in Beijing, where people could be seen waiting in the stands, while blue tents were set up to serve as makeshift clinics. This provides a glimpse of the rising COVID numbers. China reported 2,000 new COVID infections on the 14th of this month, compared with almost 2,300 a day earlier. Now watch this. Patients can be seen receiving intravenous drips on the street outside a clinic. These images are from Jiaogan in central China's Hubei province. People were also seen receiving IV drips from inside their cars that were parked outside a hospital in the city of Hanshua in the same province. The sudden loosening of restrictions has led to long queues outside fever clinics. Experts say these are worrying signs that a wave of infections is building, even though official tallies of new COVID cases have trended lower recently as authorities cut back on testing. So far, there are no official indications of a massive surge of critically ill patients. However, informal surveys and social media posts suggest huge numbers of people are being infected. The government says it's now essentially impossible to get an accurate picture of the actual numbers nationwide. Empty shelves in pharmacies across Beijing suggest things are anything but normal, contrary to the picture the Chinese government is trying to portray. Many with COVID symptoms have opted to self-medicate at home, while others are staying in to protect themselves from getting infected.
People who live with elderly, children and migrant workers need to prepare some medicine. How can you fight the virus without medicine?
Of course, we are worried. We definitely will feel concerned and panic if we can't get medicine. The COVID situation is terrible now. So we buy some medicine to fight against the virus.
Beijing has tripled the number of fever clinics to over 300. Though most of China's population is vaccinated, millions of older adults haven't yet received a booster shot. Studies show Chinese vaccines are effective in preventing hospitalization and death, but require at least 3 doses in order to be fully effective. China says around 30% of its people who are 60 or older are yet to get 3 shots. China began dismantling its tough zero-COVID controls. Last Wednesday, it dropped testing requirements and began easing quarantine rules, something that had caused mental stress to millions of residents and has battered the world's second-largest economy. The pivot away from President Xi Jinping's signature zero-COVID policy followed unprecedented and widespread protests against it. For more on this story, we're now joined by international affairs expert Greg Swenson. Greg Swenson, thanks for joining us here on WION. Now, the Chinese government says it is essentially impossible to get an accurate picture of the actual numbers nationwide. Informal surveys and social media posts suggest that a huge number of people across that country are currently being infected as we speak. We've seen pictures of people being treated on the streets outside clinics, people gathering inside a stadium in Beijing to get treatment. Is it now a clearly alarming situation, and do you get the sense that the government is trying to perhaps conceal the real picture?
Well, yes, that's a great question. And you have to assume that the government is always trying to conceal information. So anything that you get from the CCP is likely to be exaggerated or minimalized, either case. But look, the case drop has gone from the peak in late November of 38,000 to only 21,000. But you have to assume that's because the mandatory testing is no longer the case in mainland China. So that number is a complete guess. And yes, from the news reports, it looks like there is a surge. That has to be expected, given that, the best immunity for COVID is natural immunity. And because of the zero COVID or the no COVID policies, which were a complete failure, most people don't have natural immunity. And as you pointed out earlier, there's a vaccination challenge as well. Only 20% of people over 80, or I'm sorry, only 80% are vaccinated. So 20% over 80 are unvaccinated, and only 40% over 80 have received the booster. So, what we've learned in the West is that the best immunity is natural immunity. That happens by allowing people to get COVID naturally and protecting the elderly, protecting the most vulnerable. But by having this zero COVID policy, they have the worst of both. The vulnerable are not protected. They're completely unprepared in terms of the number of ICU beds in mainland China. And so they are just clearly not prepared for what has to be an anticipated or expected surge.
Well, you're quite right in pointing out, Greg, that, the zero COVID policy in China has clearly backfired. The draconian lockdowns have not helped anyone. But I want to focus a little bit on vaccination, which you just talked about. Now, it is well known that millions of older adults in China haven't received a booster shot, as you just mentioned. Studies show at least 3 doses of Chinese vaccines need to be administered for the vaccines to be fully effective. There's also this whole question of why China would not use foreign-made vaccines. But do you think this is what authorities need to primarily focus on? Vaccinate more and more people.
It's got to be one of the tools that they use, and they've failed in the past by not allowing, by maintaining this nationalist view or this sense of pride. And Xi has not permitted foreign. I'm sure that the leadership has been vaccinated with foreign vaccines, but they haven't allowed the imports of much more effective Western vaccines to enter the country. So yes, I think they will have to increase the vaccination pace for sure, especially amongst the elderly, while allowing the rest of the population who are not at risk of severe disease to get COVID naturally and create the natural immunity. The other thing they've failed to do, and they've had 3 years to do it, which is outrageous, is they have not built enough ICU beds to handle a surge in COVID. They were overconfident in this zero COVID policy, which, as you pointed out, has been a failure. But right now, mainland China has 3.6 ICU beds per 100,000 people, compared to 7.1 in Hong Kong, so less than half, and 11.4 in Singapore. And you see similar numbers in the West, especially in the United States, where it's around 9 beds. So, they've obviously failed on many fronts. I think if they're playing catch up, they're going to have to focus on immunizing or providing vaccinations for the elderly, for the most vulnerable, and then trying to increase the number of ICU beds in anticipation of possibly the failure of their own vaccines, or just the fact that the unvaccinated are at greater risk with this new wave.
Well, you are suggesting, Greg, that the government in China has failed on multiple fronts. They've erred on the vaccination front, and they've clearly failed to ramp up healthcare infrastructure, something that, as you rightly pointed out, they had 3 long years to do. How is the government going to now deal with these surging numbers remains the big question. But on that note, Greg Swenson, thank you for speaking to WION.
Thanks for having me.